The war ends. The sirens fall silent. The Nazi flags fall one by one. The gates of the concentration camps open before Allied soldiers, and the world, which for the first time confronts the horror without filters. Bodies, fences, towers, silence. But in the midst of that unforgettable scene, a question begins to form, cold and unsettling. Where are the men who guarded all this? As Germany crumbles, thousands of guards simply vanish. Uniforms are hastily discarded, documents are burned, names are abandoned. Men who yesterday guarded prisoners now mingle among civilians, cross empty roads, pretend they were never there. The war is over for the world, but for them, it has only changed form. Some are captured on the same day the camps are liberated. Others manage to escape for weeks, months, years. Some cross borders, some change their identities, some return home as if nothing had happened. No spotlight, no speeches, just silence and fear. Because from that moment on, something changes. Forever, the world begins to hunt not only the great leaders, but also the ordinary men who sustained the system from behind the walls. And every step taken after 1945 carries a shadow. Justice, revenge, oblivion, impunity, everything is intertwined. This is not a story about battles or armies. It's about the next day, about what happens when evil loses the war, but tries to survive in peace, and about how many believed they could disappear forever, without imagining that the past does not. Forget. This is where it all truly begins. The moment the world breathes a sigh of relief and at the same time plunges into shock. Germany surrenders, Allied troops advance, the camps are liberated, and what appears before the cameras and the soldiers is something no one was prepared to see. Piled up bodies, living people appearing as shadows, electric fences still hissing, empty watchtowers. But amidst all this, there's an absence that draws attention. Where are the guards? While prisoners were being found, treated, photographed, and the horror began to be documented, many of the men guarding those places were already on the move. It wasn't organized, there was no clear order, no time for sophisticated strategy. It was panic, it was instinct, it was survival. When it became clear that the war was lost, that the Allies were arriving, and that what had been done could no longer be hidden, the reaction was simple and desperate. Disappear. Guards ripped off insignia, tore armbands, threw uniforms away in the middle of the road, in rivers, in forests. Some exchanged clothes with civilians, others wore whatever they found. Many burned documents hastily, without even knowing exactly what they were destroying, only certain that those papers could not fall into the wrong hands. Names became a problem. Who you were yesterday could mean prison or death the next day. So names were forgotten, invented, adapted, and don't think they were all caricatured monsters, easy to identify. Many seemed like ordinary people. They were old enough to go home, look for their families, try to start over, and that's exactly what they tried to do. Some simply walked away from the camps, following roads full of refugees, defeated soldiers, and starving civilians. In the midst of that chaos, disappearing was easier than it seems. Nobody had complete lists. Nobody knew exactly who had done what. The confusion helped those who wanted to hide. At the same time, there were guards who couldn't escape. Some were caught inside the camps, captured by Allied soldiers at the exact moment of liberation. Others were denounced by surviving prisoners who pointed out names, faces, and behaviors. For these, the shock was immediate. Overnight, they went from being armed men in the towers to becoming prisoners, handcuffed, interrogated, surrounded by the same fear they had previously instilled. But most escaped at that first moment. And that's what makes this period so unsettling. Because while the world was beginning to understand the magnitude of the crime, thousands of people directly linked to it were dissolving into the landscape. Some returned to small villages where no one asked questions. Others crossed makeshift borders, taking advantage of the total disorganization of post-war Europe. Some hid in barns, some slept in churches, some spent weeks wandering aimlessly, just trying to buy time. And what's most disturbing is to think that, at that moment, many believed they had succeeded, that the worst was over, that all they had to do was stay quiet, not draw attention, live a simple life, and everything would be forgotten. After all, the world was too busy counting the dead, rebuilding cities, dealing with hunger and trauma. Who would have time to look for an anonymous former guard amidst millions of displaced people? But there was one detail they ignored, or pretended to ignore. What had been revealed in the camps was not something the world could simply swallow and move on from. The images, the accounts, the testimonies began to circulate, and slowly a dangerous idea for those who had fled began to gain traction. It wasn't enough to defeat the regime. Someone needed to answer for what had been done. At that initial moment, however, this was not yet clear. What existed was fear, silence, and haste. Haste to blend in, to erase traces, to become just another tired face in the defeated crowd. And it is precisely here that this story becomes more tense. Because while many thought they had escaped forever, much greater forces were beginning to move behind the scenes. And time, which seemed to be on their side, was about to turn. And while many of these men believed they had disappeared forever, something silent was beginning to change. Far from the roads and villages where they tried to blend in, decisions were being made, lists were being compiled, and the world was shifting from shock to accountability. What seemed like oblivion was, in fact, waiting. And it is from this point that this story takes on even greater weight. If this dive into what came after 1945 has already made you look at this period in a different way, stick around. By subscribing to the channel and leaving a like, you help this content reach more people who also want to understand what history didn't tell properly. And tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Because the next chapter reveals the moment when the escape began to give way to persecution, and not everyone was prepared for it. After the initial chaos subsided and the shock began to give way to tougher questions, one thing became clear. It wasn't possible to simply move on pretending nothing had happened. The liberated fields weren't just empty spaces, they were living proof of a gigantic crime. And, gradually, attention began to shift. It wasn't just about what had been found inside anymore, but about who he had kept everything running. And that's when the lives of the guards who had escaped began to change silently but decisively. At first, the prisons were almost makeshift. Allied soldiers found men hiding near the camps. Others were captured trying to flee with groups of civilians, some still wearing parts of their uniforms for lack of choice. But it soon became clear that this would not be enough. There was no complete list. Many records had been destroyed. Several guards used false names or simply said they were cooks, drivers, ordinary workers. And, amidst millions displaced by the war, separating the guilty from the innocent was an enormous challenge. That's when something fundamental began to happen. The survivors started talking. People who had spent years being silenced were now being called upon to recognize faces, point out behaviors, remember names, nicknames, shifts. It wasn't easy. Many were weak, sick, traumatized. Even so, they were the ones who knew the routine of the camps, who knew who was violent, who was in command, who chose to punish, who simply obeyed without questioning. Their memory became one of the most important tools in this process. At the same time, documents began to reappear. Not everything had been destroyed. Administrative records, personnel lists, transfers, internal orders. Each paper found helped to assemble a huge puzzle. A name here, another there, a signature, a stamp. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Serving in certain camps at certain times immediately placed someone under suspicion. The WWII idea that it was possible to have passed through there without knowing what was happening began to lose strength. But none of this was quick. Many suspects spent months, sometimes years, in prison camps, while investigations progressed slowly. Some were interrogated multiple times, others hardly spoke. There were those who denied everything, those who said they were only obeying orders, those who claimed to have never seen anything wrong. And, for the investigators, the problem was always the same: how to prove individual responsibility within a system created precisely to dilute guilt. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation rooms, life went on. Europe was in ruins, cities needed rebuilding, governments were being reorganized. Not all countries had the same urgency or the same criteria. In some places, the pressure for justice was greater. In others, the fear of political instability made investigations proceed more cautiously. This created disconcerting situations. Guards, clearly linked to the camps imprisoned in one country, while others, with similar histories, managed to remain free in another. And here's a point that makes everything even more tense. The more time passed, the harder it became to identify everyone. Witnesses died, memories became less precise, evidence was lost. For many guards who had managed to blend in with the population, each day of freedom seemed like a silent victory. But at the same time, every knock on the door, every unexpected question, every official visit rekindled the fear of being discovered. What no one knew for sure at that moment was how far this search would go, whether it would stop at the first trials or continue advancing even decades later. Because while some believed they had survived the worst phase, a new logic was beginning to form, the idea that it was not necessary to prove an isolated crime to hold someone accountable. And when this thinking begins to gain strength, the sense of security built since 1945 begins once again to crack. As investigations progress and evidence accumulates, a point is reached where delays are no longer possible. That phase of searches, interrogations, and uncertainty begins to transform into something concrete, visible, official: the trials. For many guards, this is where the feeling of simply waiting for it to pass finally ends. What was once silent fear becomes real terror, because now it's no longer about rumors or possibilities. It's about courts, judges, prosecutors, witnesses, and sentences that can define the rest of their lives. Initially, the world was still trying to understand how to judge something of that magnitude. Never before had there been an organized system to deal with crimes committed on an industrial scale, with planned, bureaucratized, and documented deaths. The top Nazi leaders were brought to trial first, and this set a huge precedent. When the world watched the Nuremberg trials, it became clear that it wasn't just about punishing leaders, but about affirming something essential. Obeying orders does not erase responsibility. This simple and devastating idea began to seep down to lower levels of the hierarchy. For the camp guards, this changes everything. Many had spent years repeating the same defense. I was just following orders. I didn't decide anything. I didn't kill anyone directly. But in court, this narrative begins to be dismantled piece by piece. Witnesses recount routines, punishments, selections, beatings, and deaths that happened in plain sight. Documents show work schedules, shifts in the towers, and transfers between camps. Little by little, it becomes difficult to maintain the idea of total ignorance. The trials, however, were not the same everywhere. Some guards were tried by Allied military tribunals soon after the war, in swift proceedings with harsh sentences. Others faced national courts years later, in lengthy trials filled with legal debates, appeals, and controversies. There were cases where guilt seemed evident, but direct evidence was weak. In others, cruelty was undeniable, but the records had been destroyed. Each trial was a battle of its own, and this created constant tension. For those being judged, each hearing was a confrontation with a past that many had tried to erase. For the survivors, it was the chance sometimes the only one, to be heard. Many returned to court even decades later, already elderly, to face people they had only seen behind weapons. And uniforms. It wasn't revenge, it was memory. It was the need to say, "This happened and you were there." Sentences varied widely. Some guards were sentenced to death. Others received life imprisonment. Many received lighter sentences of a few years, which caused outrage and frustration among those who expected harsher punishments. But these differences did not stem solely from arbitrary decisions. They reflected the limitations of the justice system at the time, the legal loopholes, the difficulty of legally classifying crimes that lacked clear precedents. Justice was advancing, but stumbling. Meanwhile, outside the courtrooms, the world was changing rapidly. The Cold War was beginning to reshape priorities. Countries that were once enemies now needed to reorganize politically. And in this scenario, some cases lost momentum, others were postponed, some simply shelved. For some guards, this meant reduced sentences or even early release. For others, it meant years living under the shadow of a trial that could happen at any moment. What is most unsettling is that even with functioning courts, the feeling of impunity never completely disappeared. The question always remained: how many were left out? How many never sat in the defendant's chair? How many managed to live ordinary lives for decades while their past remained buried? This doubt accompanies every sentence, every acquittal, every conviction. And that's exactly where this story gains a new layer of tension. Because, while some believed that the chapter on trials had closed, a silent shift in the way the law was interpreted was beginning to emerge. A shift that sooner or later would make many people realize that time was not on the side of those who believed that simply waiting would lead to being forgotten. After the sentences began to be announced, reality hit like a weight, difficult to ignore. For many guards, the trial didn't end when the judge banged the gavel. That's when life truly split in two. Some went straight from the courtroom to prison, others to the gallows, and there were also those who, to the surprise of many, received sentences that seemed far too lenient in light of what had been revealed. This contrast is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of this whole story, because it shows that justice did not advance in a straight, clean, or equal way for everyone. For those condemned to death, the end was swift, but not simple. The executions took place in different countries, under different rules, but always fraught with tension. Many of these men spent their last days trying to deny what they had done, insisting they were merely cogs in a larger machine. Others remained completely silent. Some wrote letters. Others refused to say anything. There were no heroic final speeches. There was silence, fear, and the belated realization that the uniform that once gave them power now offered no protection whatsoever. For those who received prison sentences, the situation was different but no less burdensome. Life imprisonment for some, decades in jail for others. The routine consisted of cells, sporadic interrogations, review hearings, waiting, a lot of waiting. And here's an important detail. Not all prisons were the same. Some were in harsh conditions, others in penitentiary systems that over time became more lenient. This fueled a constant feeling of injustice, especially among survivors and families of the victims. But perhaps the hardest aspect to swallow was the short sentences. Guards who spent years working in concentration camps, witnessing daily violence, participating in the routine of extermination, sometimes received only a few years in prison, in some cases, less than 10 years. To those watching from the outside, this seemed absurd. For those who had survived the camps, it was almost unbearable. The explanation lay in the limits of the law. Without direct evidence of individual murder, many courts opted for lighter sentences, even while acknowledging participation in the system, and time began to play a decisive role. As the years passed, sentence reviews, parole requests, claims of good behavior, and health problems emerged. Europe needed to rebuild, and political priorities shifted. The Cold War altered alliances and created new urgencies. Gradually, the focus shifted from punishing the past to stabilizing the present. This had direct consequences. Many convicts were released before serving their full sentences. Imagine the impact of that. Men who had been tried for participation in concentration camps returning to society, walking the same streets, working, starting families, growing old in relative tranquility. For them, it was a chance for a fresh start. For the world, an open wound. It wasn't uncommon for neighbors not to know who that person had been. In some cases, not even the family itself had complete knowledge of the past. At the same time, there were those who remained imprisoned until the end of their lives. They grew old behind bars, watching from a distance as a world moved on without them. For them, the punishment was total, but still surrounded by questions. Was it justice? Was it enough? Was it too late? These doubts never completely disappeared. What makes this period even more unsettling is realizing that there was no clear pattern. Two guards with similar backgrounds could have had completely different fates. One executed, the other released after a few years. One sentenced to life imprisonment, the other living in freedom before even completing a decade behind bars. This created a bitter feeling that luck, the country where they were tried, and the historical moment weighed almost as much as the crimes themselves. And while some believed that all this represented the end of the matter, that justice had already done what it could, a silent shift was beginning to take shape. An idea that wasn't yet entirely clear, but was slowly growing. Perhaps, simply, having served in certain places was enough for accountability, regardless of the time elapsed. And when this notion begins to gain traction, the relief of those who left prison too early begins to transform, once again, into unease. As the years passed, something curious began to happen. From the outside, it seemed the chapter was closing. Trials had taken place, sentences had been handed down, prison sentences served, at least in part. The general feeling was that the world needed to move on, to rebuild cities, economies, political relationships. And in this movement, many believed the matter was resolved. But for several of the guards who had been convicted, this moving on meant something very concrete. Prison doors opening sooner than expected. Early releases began to become increasingly common. Claims of good conduct, health problems, advanced age, changes in criminal laws, all of these factors began to weigh in. Some had been sentenced to long terms, but were released after only a few years. Others, who had received relatively harsh sentences, saw their sentences reduced in later reviews. And, little by little, these men returned to circulate freely in society, often without fanfare, without headlines, without public explanations. To an outsider, especially decades later, this might seem almost surreal. People directly linked to concentration camps now living ordinary lives, working, going to markets, raising children, growing old in quiet neighborhoods. In many cases, the neighbors had no idea who that silent man had been during the war. In others, they only knew fragments, half-told stories, always with ready-made justifications. It was a different time. Everyone obeyed orders. He had no choice. The reintegration of these former guards was not official, organized, or clearly supervised. It simply happened. The legal system released them, society absorbed it, and silence did the rest. There were no public apologies, no direct confrontations with the affected communities. For many survivors of the camps, it was as if the world had decided to turn the page without asking if they were ready for it. And here's a point that weighs heavily. While some former guards rebuilt their routines, the survivors continued to deal with daily traumas, nightmares, illnesses, irreparable family losses. Many never managed to rebuild their lives with the same ease. This inequality created a wound that is difficult to heal. the feeling that those who caused the suffering had, in some cases, a second chance more quickly than those who survived it. Over time, this unease began to resurface in the form of public questioning. News reports, journalistic investigations, reopened documents. Historians and prosecutors began to revisit old cases and realize something unsettling. The idea that justice had been served might be more of an illusion than a reality. Many cases had been closed too soon. Many stories had been accepted without sufficient questioning. And yet, for a time, it seemed that nothing would change. The advanced age of many former guards acted almost as a moral shield. Why stir this up now? Some asked. What will it solve? Others argued that time had done its work and that reopening wounds would only bring more pain. This debate created a kind of uncomfortable pause, a heavy silence between the past and the present. But this silence was not complete, because in forgotten archives, in resurfaced documents, in testimonies that had never been heard, something continued to accumulate. A slow yet firm realization that certain crimes do not age, that time does not erase responsibilities, and that living in freedom for decades does not necessarily mean being free from history. For many of these former guards, the years of tranquility created a false sense of security. They believed the world had forgotten, that no one would knock on the door anymore, that the past was definitively buried. But as they grew old, believing this, a silent shift began to take shape in their understanding of justice, and when that shift finally became visible, it would become clear that some pages are never truly forgotten, no matter how much time has passed. As time passed, and that false sense of forgetfulness spread, something began to change almost imperceptibly, but profoundly. It didn't happen overnight, nor did it come with grand announcements. It was a slow turnaround, built in files, courts, and legal discussions that almost no one followed. The question that began to bother investigators and prosecutors was simple but powerful. What if the mistake wasn't the lack of individual evidence, but the way guilt had been perceived from the beginning? For decades, many trials had consistently run into the same obstacle. To convict a guard, it was necessary to prove that he had committed a specific murder on a specific day against a specific victim. But concentration camps didn't work that way. They were machines, organized. Systems designed to kill, exploit, and destroy people continuously. And each guard, regardless of whether or not they pulled the trigger, was part of that operation. Without them, none of that would have been possible. When this idea begins to gain traction, everything changes. Serving as a guard in an extermination camp is no longer seen as a detail, but as an act of direct complicity. Being there, watching, preventing escapes, escorting prisoners, maintaining order, all of this comes to be understood as active participation in the crime. And this undermines the main defense used by many former guards for years, that they hadn't killed anyone with their own hands. This shift in legal understanding opens doors that had been closed for decades. Old cases are being re-evaluated, forgotten files are being reopened. Prosecutors are now cross-referencing lists of camp employees with survivor records and administrative documents. And suddenly, very elderly men, some over 80 or 90 years old, are being investigated again. For them, it's a shock. Many believed that that part of their lives was definitively behind them. The scenes are repeated in different countries. Knocks on doors in quiet neighborhoods. Interviews with people who have led discreet lives for decades. Former guards being taken to court in wheelchairs, wearing hearing aids, accompanied by lawyers who insist on the same argument. It's too late now. But the response from the courts is beginning to change. Late or not, the responsibility remains. These belated trials have an impact worldwide. For some, they are a relief, the feeling that even if it takes time, justice can still reach those who believed they had escaped. For others, they generate discomfort. Some question the usefulness of judging such elderly people. Some say that this does not change the past. But for the survivors and for historical memory, the meaning is different. It is not about revenge. It is about making it clear that certain crimes do not morally prescribe. And what is most disturbing is realizing how many of these men reacted. Some continued to deny everything until the end. Others admitted their presence in the camps, but minimized the role they played. Very few showed genuine remorse. This further reinforced the perception that silence and denial had been survival strategies, not signs of acknowledged guilt. Each new trial reignited public debate and reminded the world that history was not completely resolved, that there were still gaps, that there were still names that had never been mentioned, and for those who had lived for decades believing that time would protect them, this new reality was a clear warning. Peace built on forgetting is fragile. And while these belated convictions were taking place, one last question began to form, almost inevitable. After all this, after arrests, releases, escapes, trials, and reopenings of cases, what really remained for these men? What was the final fate of those who spent their lives trying to escape their own history? It is this answer that closes the circle and makes it clear that, for some, the end was never as simple as it seemed. Ultimately, when time did what it always does and began to erase faces, voices, and dates, the fate of the concentration camp guards spread along very different paths, but all marked by the same weight. Many died without ever being judged. Some grew old in silence, carrying a past that few around them knew in its entirety. Others spent the last years of their lives dealing with belated trials, slow hearings, and the public humiliation of finally being called by the name they had tried to hide for decades. And there were also those who died in prison, far from any recognition, leaving behind only cold records in judicial files. Looking at all this from a distance, what becomes clear is that there was no simple or satisfactory resolution. There was no moment when the world could say, "Now it's resolved." The story remained open, full of gaps, names that never appeared on lists, and decisions that came too late. For many survivors, justice was incomplete. For others, it never came. And this profoundly shaped how the world came to view these crimes. Over the years, something important became established, the understanding that the camps were not the work of a few isolated monsters. They functioned because thousands of people participated, accepted, obeyed, and remained silent. The guards were not extras. They were an essential part of the system. This perception changed books, courts, classrooms, and the way collective responsibility came to be discussed. It was no longer just about leaders or orders from above, but about the sum of individual choices made every day. Today, when we talk about these guards, the discussion goes beyond punishment. It enters the realm of memory. Museums, documentation centers, and educational projects are keen to show that the danger lies not only in the distant past, but in the idea that ordinary people can sustain systems of extreme violence when they fail to question. The legacy left by these men is not what they said about themselves, but what the world has learned by analyzing their trajectories. And there is something deeply unsettling about all of this. Many of these guards lived long enough to see the world officially condemn what they were a part of. They saw the historical consensus form, saw the narrative of obedience dismantled, saw the word complicity gain strength. Some watched in silence, others with outrage, others feigning indifference. But the historical judgment, unlike the judicial one, offered no absolution. Their ultimate fate lies not only in how they died, but in the mark they left. Their names appear in legal proceedings, lists, studies, documentaries, not as glorified protagonists, but as warnings, as examples of what happens when the normalization of violence takes hold. And that is perhaps the hardest and part to accept. Even after so many decades, their story still serves as a mirror, and that is precisely why this narrative doesn't end with a sense of complete closure, because everything that happened afterward, the escapes, the trials, the releases, the belated convictions, points to something bigger, a constant reminder that time may delay justice, but it does not erase responsibility. And when this understanding finally sets in, it becomes impossible not to mentally return to the beginning of it all, to that moment when the gates opened in 1945 and the world had to decide what to do with those who believed they would never be called to account. And now that you've come this far, tell me honestly, what did this story evoke in you? This type of question doesn't have a right answer, but it gains strength when it's shared. Write in the comments what struck you the most. Your reflection might touch someone who also needs to hear it. By liking and subscribing to the channel, you help this content stay alive and reach more people interested in real, profound, and necessary stories. Keep following the channel, because there are still many stories like this waiting to be told, and each one changes the way we see the past and the present.